installment of Decode the Debate, Georgia Alliance for Social Justice discussion series. I'm so excited that everyone could join us today. We will be recording this and putting it on our YouTube and then sharing it for later so you can share it with all your folks. If you haven't already, introduce yourself in the chat where you're calling from. We would love to know who we all have with us today. My name is Fallon McClure. I'm the Executive Director for Georgia Alliance for Social Justice. And today I am joined by two amazing women. I'm so grateful that they're willing to share their time with us today. We have Mariah Parker and Tiffany Roberts. I'm going to read just a little bit about them. If I'm looking around at my screen all crazy, it's because I'm trying to admit people in from the waiting room and click through tabs. So please bear with me. I promise I'm not as crazy as I probably seem right now, or maybe I am. But anyway, let's see. Mariah Parker is part of the new wave of young women of color entering politics. She first made headlines after being sworn in as an Athens-Clarke County Commissioner at 26 with her hand on a copy of the autobiography of Malcolm X held by her mother. Photos of her taking her oath went viral, highlighting the growing numbers of millennial Black women making their voices heard in local politics nationwide. She is also openly queer, a hip hop artist, and a PhD candidate in linguistics at the University of Georgia, where she is also a graduate teaching assistant in the Department of Language and Literacy Education, and a community organizer dedicated to transformative politics and civic engagement. As county commissioner, she is focusing on creating economic stability and racial justice, as well as criminal justice reform and raising the minimum wage. So that is Miss Parker. And then let me tell y'all about Tiffany. Let's see, Tiffany Williams Roberts joined Southern Center for Human Rights in April 2018 as the Community Engagement and Movement Building Counsel. She is a civil rights and criminal defense attorney in Atlanta. She has practiced criminal defense since 2008, first as a public defender with the Atlanta Judicial Circuit public defender, and later as a solo practitioner beginning in 2011. As a public defender, she represented hundreds of indigent clients facing felony prosecution, and she graduated from the Gideon's Promise Trial Advocacy Program. She expanded her private practice to include civil rights litigation for victims of police abuse. A significant portion of Tiffany's practice is dedicated to was dedicated to pro bono representation of activists and organizers. She's been recognized by the Atlanta NAACP, the DeKalb Lawyers Association, and the Southern Center for Human Rights for movement lawyering and social justice activism. Additionally, she's volunteered with numerous organizations promoting justice, fairness, and equity in the criminal justice system for her entire legal career. She's a community organizer. She co-founded Police Accountability Organization, Building Locally, blocks in 2008 to promote a holistic approach to public safety. It successfully advocated for legislative improvements to the Atlanta Citizens Review Board, along with other critical local policy changes. In 2015, she co-founded the Lawyers United for New Atlanta in response to calls for criminal justice reforms in Atlanta courtrooms. She's also a founding member of the Atlanta chapter of the Global Black Lives Matter Network, which first convened in 2015. And the list goes on and on and on because Tiffany is just that amazing. And so I'm so grateful to have both Mariah and Tiffany here today for this conversation. Thank you all for joining us. Again, like I said, this will be recorded and and shared later for your folks that missed it. Also, let's see, trying to get all the housekeeping stuff out of the way. Also, this is part of a series. We have these every 2 weeks. In 2 weeks, we will have Fee Nguyen from Asian Americans Advancing Justice, along with Susie Duran from Poder Latinx to talk about immigration policy under Biden. And so we're just gonna keep going. So also, if you guys have any thoughts and suggestions on other topics of interest, please let me know. But with that being said, I'm going to kick it to Tiffany and Mariah to introduce themselves, and we'll get going on what is Defund really.
Okay, well, thank you so much for the wonderful introduction, Fallon, and thank you all for being here. I don't know what more to say about myself that he didn't already say, but I guess as additional context, I have served as a county commissioner here in Athens-Clarke County since 2018. And last summer was the author of something called the 50-10 plan, which proposed a 50% reduction in our police force over the next 10 years, replacing those sworn officers with mental health responders, restorative justice mediators, and other forms of non-police, compassionate, and holistic crisis response, modeled after programs that have been working for decades in places like Eugene, Oregon. And so I've continuing that work today, and I've studied the work of people like Angela Davis, Derek Purnell, Ruth Wilson Gilmore, Alex Vitale for years now. And I'm really excited about the moment that we're in to have a popular push that has brought those ideas into the mainstream and are seeing them enacted in municipal governments across the country. So thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me. I'm always grateful to be with Fallon and anything that she convenes, and it's always good to see Mariah. I hate that bio is so long, so I don't think there's anything else I need to share about myself, but please feel free to reach out to me if you do have any questions. My email address is troberts@schr.org, which is Southern Center for Human Rights website.
Thank you. And so we'll get started. Tiffany, can you help us with what's like some background on Defund?
Sure, and I have some slides. I hope that's okay. It's just a, can I share my screen, Fallon?
Of course, let me make you a host.
Okay. All right. So I'm only using these slides, not because I want to trap you all in a PowerPoint presentation, but because it's easier for me to organize my thoughts that way. And so the first thing I want to say is this, regardless of what words we use when we were talking about prison abolition or the defund the police movement, what's important to note is that there is nothing new about Black-led movement finding ways to tear down harmful systems while working to build up systems that better serve our communities. And so it's really important to think about that, because I know there are a lot of critiques of the terminology used related to this campaign. And there has never been a campaign launched by Black-led organizers in this country that was met with open arms from people who are obstructive. And so to the extent that people are uncomfortable with the words defund the police, I just want to encourage us as we talk about this to move past that discomfort and consider what we're looking to build up while we break down. At the heart of the defund the police movement, should I just let everybody in now that I'm the host?
Sorry, if you can make me a co-host, then I can.
Okay, well, the camera fell. But at the heart of defund the police is acknowledging that all money from the government goes somewhere, right? And that we are interested, even people who aren't taxpayers should be interested in the money that the government spends being used to fortify and empower as opposed to being used to harm. And so this phrase or this terminology that we hear, budgets or moral documents, that actually comes from Dr. King. And I know that Dr. King is often held up as a model by moderates, ignoring his revolutionary lens, especially when it comes to economic frameworks. Are y'all seeing a black box on my screen? Okay. All right. So first is this idea that police prevent crime, or that policing makes us safer. And that's not grounded in data, right? And so again, this idea of abolition is just sort of integral to who Black folks have been for the duration of our time in this country, abolishing slavery and now abolishing a system that is harmful in many of the same ways that enslavement was harmful to us. And so just remembering that most violent crime, or a good bit of violent crime, goes unsolved. And so this idea that policing keeps us safe is flawed, right? That is a flawed proposition. We know that policing is a remnant of chattel slavery. that slave patrols in this country were the first iteration of what we know to be policing in America. And that, again, that's something that makes people very uncomfortable. But American policing in and of itself is unique. And to the extent that other countries' systems of policing look like American policing, it is because the model has been borrowed. We have exported this model of police occupation, especially where people are poor or othered in different nations. And so while there was, so at the time that slave patrols arose as our first kind of model police forces, a model for policing in the South, we also had some cities like Boston standing up police forces because the merchants got tired of being responsible for securing their own wares. And that's important because prior to this time, which is for the majority that people have inhabited the earth, the responsibility of securing one's goods was not something that police were charged with doing. Many of you are familiar with the Aid to Abolition framework, and it was a paradigm shift. During the summer last year, there was a popular, I don't want to call it a campaign, but what would you call it, Mariah? 8 Can't Wait was raised as like a list of things that cities could do to reduce police violence. And in response to that, some young organizers, abolitionist organizers, I think one of them, at least one of them is on this call, rolled out Aid to Abolition. And the reason that that was important is because Aid to Abolition proposes reforms that actually begin the work of dismantling the prison industrial complex, especially when it comes to policing. And we should think of this as a continuation of the work of people that Mariah mentioned, a continuation of the work of Critical Resistance, which was founded in 1997, a prison abolition organization. But in remembering that before that, Black folks in this country understood that the prison industrial complex was harmful to our communities in very concrete ways. So I was just using, this is, I think this presentation might be from a few months ago, but a tremendous amount of money goes into policing. And so as we've seen funding for things like schools, public mental health and behavioral health services, healthcare generally, infrastructure, mass transit, we have seen dollars plummet for all of those categories across the country. At the same time, we have seen the unprecedented ballooning of police budgets. And so this was a proposed budget for fiscal year 19, but I think somewhere Atlanta's budget for policing is somewhere around like $246 million if you are, hold on, I'm letting people in. If you add up all of the monies, the dollars that come from other parts of the budget, not specifically. I said all of that to say that as we've seen dollars plummet in other areas, we've seen them grow in police budgets. And that is not because you would think that the argument that followed would be like, policing is so effective, we are so much safer. Now there's a time for the money, for the dollars that we're pouring into policing to level off. The Vera Institute has a study called the Prison Paradox. And in the Prison Paradox, they discuss how there is actually an inverse relationship between crime and incarceration. And crime being harm as defined by the state, right? Harm as penalized by the state. And so I'll stop sharing because this is a lot of Atlanta specific stuff, but I just want for us to just think about the Defund the Police framework as really a prison abolitionist framework that people borrow from different parts of. So there are people who want to dismantle the prison industrial complex in its entirety, right? And then there are people who are working within that framework for incremental non-reformist reforms. Ooh, I just can't win today. But reforms that don't further harden lines. And so an example of that would be not advocating for policies that can only benefit people if the state has determined that they committed what's called a non-violent crime. Thinking about how, because at Southern Center for Human Rights, we were formed as a death penalty, founded as a death penalty abolitionist law firm. And that means we represent a lot of people who are accused of committing acts of violence. And so in our work, we don't we don't draw that violent, nonviolent line to say only this category of people, only people who are accused of drug offenses, only people who are accused of nonviolent offenses are entitled to relief. We believe that there can be other systems. Mariah talked about non-law enforcement responses to harm and shrinking the size of law enforcement in our communities. And that is at the heart of the work that many folks are doing in Atlanta and around the country, Atlanta, Athens, and around the country, to say, what happens if we don't rely on police to respond to every crisis? And how can we fund, or to crisis, right? And how can we fund better solutions? So for example, in Atlanta, Atlanta just launched a 311 system that allows non-law enforcement folks to respond to, for example, mental health crises. And it came out of our pre-arrest diversion program. And one story I always tell is the first call that our 311 non-emergency response system got earlier this year, when it was stood up, was someone sleeping in a car. And that was the kind of call that caused the death of Rayshard Brooks. So what could have happened if we had been successful in building a non-law enforcement response to harm prior to summer 2020? And how can we ensure that the line item for those kinds of things are just as important in the budget as education and other things that ensure that our communities are well funded in healing and self-determined?
Thank you, Tiffany, for that background. So Mariah, how did you get involved in sort of criminal justice reform and defund movement specifically?
Well, particularly while I was running for office first in 2018 was when I first read Our Prison's Obsolete by Angela Davis, which introduced me to the idea of, as Tiffany was describing, you know, budgets being moral documents, the reversal of priorities that make communities whole, safe, strong, and compassionate. So the fact that not only are we investing more in punishment than we are in foundational supports in the community that eliminate the sources of harm, that this is intentional, and that this has grown out of slavery abolition and the need for social control sort of evolving into the prison industrial complex, the ballooning of the Black population that is incarcerated in the South following emancipation as a way to continually keep this permanent undercast of folks that, you know, aren't fully integrated into life in the United States. And so that then began to frame a lot of my governance, you know, questioning the militarization of our police through an increase in their budgets for new, you know, weapons of war, effectively new trainings and use of force that are still, you know, talking about how to use physical force against our citizenry, and having community conversations with my constituents about what sorts of needs we have in the community, and realizing, making the connection between the fact that every single month in our commission discussions, we're funding something new for the police, but we could never, for some reason, never get funding for more youth programming. We never seem to be talking about food security in our community and how to make sure everyone's fed. There's never enough dollars for affordable housing. There's never enough money for job skills training. And when I would talk to constituents on the phone or go knock on their doors, as a community organizer, I'd regularly hear, like, I can't pay my rent this month, I don't know what to do. I gotta, you know, I'm living with my boyfriend that is abusive towards my kids because we don't have anywhere else to go. Or I would see neighbors, you know, living around this corner from a homeless shelter who would come to knock on my door asking for money, who would talk about how they would be, you know, harassed by the police for sleeping outdoors, instead of us investing on the front end to keep those people safe and keep our neighbors safe by actually putting a roof over those people's heads. And so that was some of the work I did last summer, just a lot of theorizing around what it means, like, to enact some of the ideas of the prison abolition movement in a municipal context. It obviously came to a head in the summer of 2020, where the Overton window shift drastically to the left with regards to the ideas of a world without police as we know it, popular demands emerging for a transition of city dollars from punishment into preventative and compassionate community supports. And so that's when I really started to become not only just like a student of abolition, and which I still am today, but a local leader with regards to educating the public around what our city money currently goes to, what we can do municipally to reprioritize, human lives over punishment, over incarceration, over social control. And so it's been a long time coming, like many years of study, but it's certainly come to a head in the last year as people try to figure out what do we do in this moment, since our current situation has become untenable.
Awesome, thank you. And Tiffany, how did you get involved in, I guess, sort of defund, but criminal justice reform? Like, why did you choose this path as a lawyer and not go to into I don't know, corporate law or something that would have made you a lot of money? Oh.
Thank you. So I got involved as a public defender. I became frustrated with the limitations of criminal litigation, and so did many of my friends. And one day, one of my friends named Anna Kirian said, "Hey, my friend is having this meeting at her house. We're starting an organization," because at that time there had been a killing of a bartender in a white neighborhood in Atlanta. And the police response was to do as many things, to lock up a whole bunch of children and say that they were all in a gang, regardless of whether they were related to or involved in the murder. And then also a group was stood up called ATAC, Atlantans Together Against Crime. And so we formed this group called Building Locally to Organize for Community Safety. And it was explicitly abolitionist in nature because so many of the organizers had come from New Orleans post-Katrina and had been involved with critical resistance. And so it allowed us to do things that weren't possible in criminal courtrooms to help this is my daughter. We're kind of on a quasi vacation that would allow us to do the other things, to talk about the way the police were abusive. We had what was called the Red Dog Unit in Atlanta, which is infamous in Atlanta hip hop, run every drug dealer out of Georgia. But that unit was responsible for so much devastation. And so we organized around the Atlanta Citizens Review Board, standing up a true independent review of police conduct, and then also dismantling or disbanding the Red Dog Unit. And many of the people who I organized with back in 08, 09 are now also still doing this work, just in different places. So now I'm at Southern Center, where before I was a public defender, and Southern Center was just a helpful organization, willing to write memos and other things to help us when we were going down to City Hall or courting candidates looking to be elected, drafting scorecards, and all of those kinds of things. I think that it's really important. There are all these conversations about federal legislation, and federal legislation can be helpful, but so much of this fight has to be done on the local level in partnership with people like Mariah. Because the dollars, the procedures, the policies, all of the things that control or that most proximately impact police conduct are controlled by local rule makers in the local communities that pressure them. So I'm really proud of that, of Blocks and the work we were able to do, and just grateful that there are always people in communities who are willing to do the hard, thankless work of organizing.
Thank you. And Mariah, considering we've had, at the very least, being brutalized on camera since 1992 with Rodney King, why was George Floyd last summer a tipping point? We still had already had Ahmaud Arbery earlier that year. We've had Philando Castile. We've had, Sandra Bland. The list goes on and on, right? Walter Scott. And there's so many hashtags that you almost forget. And I hate to even say that, right? But what was a tipping point about George Floyd?
So I do believe that the pandemic, with the economic precarity that it had put many people into, the social isolation many people are experiencing, the sense of uncertainty for the future, as well as, the loss we experienced, people losing loved ones or becoming ill themselves, really struck a nerve, or really put people, I should say, in a very vulnerable place, where something as graphic as watching the death of George Floyd hit people in a way that they weren't able to certainly brush off, because they had been so worn down by these other social factors at play. And so I do try to bring people's attention back to Ferguson, back to the Watts riots, back to the many times that folks have risen up against police violence in our history, that, while this did feel like a tipping point, while there were, tens of millions of people in the street last summer, this is a part of a long legacy of people who have been bearing witness to police violence in our communities, rising up against it, and as well as popular movements to that degree. Also, we're drawing today on a long history of scholarship of people that have studied these issues, who have worked in communities around these issues, both, thinking theoretically around the problems, as well as gathering qualitative data from the lived experience of folks in communities impacted by police violence. And so there is a long history here, but it did, I think, because of the pandemic and the social and economic precarity folks were experiencing, make it so that folks could not turn away, could not change the channel, could not simply forget about it. They, felt the need to get out and do something.
Got you. Do you have any thoughts about why last summer was a tipping point, Tiffany?
Yes, I agree with everything that Mariah said, and I last summer felt like it wasn't happening almost. It really, because of all of the different things that were happening. So when the uprisings began during the summer, many of us were doing the really hard work of trying to get people out of prisons and jails, because we were trying to avoid what has become a reality, which is people in jails and prisons have disproportionately contracted and died from COVID-19. And so it felt like a moment where we were just swallowed up by the work already. And I think that many people felt that way because of the pandemic, no matter what their, line of work was or is. And then I think that since 2015, a lot has happened with the way we share information on social media, and a lot of movement infrastructure has been built, despite what detractors might argue. A lot has been built up since then. And I think mobilizing people became easier. And, to many people's surprise, people were willing to risk their lives by, going outdoors during a pandemic that we really didn't know much about, because they felt like they were dying anyway. And the killing of George Floyd came after a lot of reforms, right? A lot of reforms happened after Philando Castile was killed in that same part of the country. And I think there was I don't even want to call it an awakening. There is an acknowledgement of the limitations of legislative reforms as the primary or sole avenue through which we seek justice, through which Black folks in this country seek redress. And in many ways, taking the streets, showing up and speaking is the thing that gets folks' attention, is the thing that makes people nervous. And I'm seeing the question about the anti-defund bill that I know Mariah is gonna talk about, that was before the legislature, and then the many anti-protester bills, one really scary one in Florida in particular, that passed since then, because that is the thing I think that most threatens establishment politics, is for people to not only go to the ballot box and vote, which is important, but that they exercise their voices and mobilize year round. That is the thing that is most is scariest. And I think it's interesting when we talk about Ahmaud Arbery and Trayvon Martin, we talk about their killings in the same way that we talk about George Floyd and Philando Castile. And I think that is an acknowledgement of the fact that though George Zimmerman was not a police officer, though the McMichaels were not police officers, they were performing the function of violently exacting social control on certain parts of the community, right, as private citizens. So that means we understand that the hashtag Blue Lives Matter rose to popularity. It first spiked after Trayvon Martin was killed and after George Zimmerman was acquitted. And again, George Zimmerman is not a police officer. So that means we understand policing to be much more expansive than merely stopping crime. It is to suppress, right? To suppress and control others in this country. And those others are often Black and poor, Indigenous, brown, right? Trans, those people are those that are supposed to be controlled by policing, whether that policing is done by agents of the state or private citizens exercising like a parallel authority.
And you briefly mentioned it, Tiffany. Can you just touch on, for maybe folks that don't know, at the state level, what was passed regarding defund or anti-defund, and then we'll have Mariah talk about how it actually, what impact, if any, it actually has on the city level.
Sure. So Houston Gaines passed, there was a piece of legislation. What
HB
was it?
286.
286. What was it?
HB 286.
286, yeah. And there were some changes to it over the course of the legislative session. And we actually had like 3 or 4 anti-defund bills, anti-protester bills before the legislature this session, but this is the one that passed. It is prohibiting local governments from reducing their policing or their law enforcement budgets by more than, is it 10% on a roll, 5% on a rolling 10-year basis or something. But that's how it started. And where we ended up was that governments could do that as long as they post it publicly and hold public meetings. What's also interesting is that there are these other provisions that say, you know, it doesn't apply to agencies that experience an equal loss in revenue. So if you have a 5% dip in revenue for your city, the law doesn't apply to you. And there are all of these other paragraphs in the bill, but the intent is clear. If you go to PEN America, I think they have detailed all of the anti-defunds, all of the anti-speech, and Law for Black Lives might have done so as well. All of those, the anti-movement bills that pass, and that is just a confrontation or an attack on Black-led movement, Black-led mobilizations across the country. And again, it comes out of this law and order framework that persistently paints Black folks as the ungovernable, dangerous members of our society. And the only way to address their conduct is by pumping money into police departments without any support from data to substantiate that particular assertion.
And Mariah, does that have any real impact, or what does that do?
No, it's really important to me to make clear to people that really it increases government transparency, which is wonderful. Georgia municipalities are required to hold public hearings on their budgets every single year anyway. And so we hear from dozens and dozens and hours of public comment from folks about property taxes, about things they like to see in the budget at City Hall once every spring when we are getting ready to pass our city budget. And so this provision that makes it so that any reduction in the police budget needs to be announced in the local papers ahead of a public hearing is just an extension of practices that we already undertake as a matter of good governance, as well as, you know, adherence to state law. And so I bring this up because I think it's also very important that that we continue to push on our local elected officials who may not understand the full machinations of this new law. If it is passed by Governor Kemp, I'm not sure if it has been signed by him yet, but some folks will point to it without really knowing what's in it, like, oh, well, this can't be done. And so educating them around, actually, it can. And so the folks who may be sympathetic to reallocation of police budgets towards foundational community supports, not using this as a shield to avoid this very heavy work of trying to get through reforms that the movement has been clamoring for and the Black organizers have been pushing for a long time.
So what can folks do, Mariah, to get more involved in the process at the city level, and then Tiffany as like sort of organizational wide or community wide?
So, I mean, I think that it does involve, like, our work does involve a lot of popular political education in our communities, because there's still a lot of people who are very, who have cemented their position around defund based on, misinformation or a lack of, or just, just no information at all, just, from the perception of a slogan. And I like to oftentimes talk people through like an example of a crisis that may happen to them. For example, someone breaks into your house and steals your TV. Rather than saying, well, what happens, what happens without police? Asking the question, why did that person do that in the first place? Did they break into your house because they, have kids at home they can't feed, and they're going to sell your TV so that they can, buy textbooks for them next semester? Are they experiencing some drug abuse issues and need money to fuel their habit? All these are things that could have been prevented by community investments in community supports. If that person's experiencing food insecurity and that's why they broke into your house, we need to ramp up food programs in our community so people aren't breaking into each other's houses. That person's experienced a substance abuse issue, that person needs to get connected to healthcare supports to help them kick or manage their habit. And so having conversations in our community about how investments in community supports actually prevent crime better than the police do, who in the instance of showing up and after your TV gets stolen will probably file a police report, then tell you you'll never get your TV back, and then leave. And so a lot of the work is still community organization with regards to having those conversations with our neighbors, finding out when in your city they're going to pass your city budget, and going ahead and speaking with your city council person or your county commissioner about what you want to see invested in the community. So once you start identifying some of the regular crises that people in your community are experiencing, if there's issues of food insecurity, issues of substance abuse, maybe there's property crimes, maybe there's speeding, approaching your representatives about what you want to see funded instead. Because I think one thing that has been a barrier for people sort of joining the calls to defund the police is that people don't always understand where that money goes. When you take it from the police, what happens? When there's no police on the streets, what happens? And so framing those conversations with your city council person is, this is what I think we need to invest in. And as an aside, this is where I think the money should come from. And that together, this still is an effective program of public safety. If we're keeping people fed so they're not getting caught stealing Slim Jims from the 7-Eleven, if we're keeping people off the streets so they're not breaking into houses to sleep at night, et cetera. And so think about what you want to see funded. What kind of programming do you need in your community in order to bring down crime? In addition to one program we're working on here in Athens is a non-police crisis response program. We expanded our crisis intervention teams in the police department last year, sort of a compromise from the bolder plan that I put forward. But it's so important for so many folks that if they're having a mental health crisis, if they're having a substance abuse issue, if they need a wellness check, it is not a police officer that shows up at their door, because that can very easily escalate the situation. And so this is modeled after programs that have worked in many other cities. The Cahoots program in Eugene, Oregon has been operational since 1989, doing this work where non-police show up to deal with situations that are quote unquote low level, people who just need a helping hand and otherwise would be met with force or locked in jail for something like sleeping on the sidewalk or panhandling. And so digging into what those models can look like and proposing those to the folks that control your city budget. Because imagine if we fund a program like that, as well as a slightly reduced police budget, that's still the same amount of money going into public safety. It's just diversified how we are spending it. And so that's another thing that your local government can do and that folks can push for. And then, yes, actually, I'll stop there because I'm sure Tiffany has a lot of other really great stuff to add. And I rambled.
Well, those are amazing. And I think, just advocating on your local level, and also just my plug, municipal elections are so important, and we tend to not pay as much attention to them as like presidential year elections and gubernatorial, et cetera. But the folks at your city councils and your county commissions are going to have more impact on your daily lives, way more than perhaps the president. So
yeah,
my little shameless plug.
Yeah, and what my quick addition to that is, as a fun fact, I won my election by 13 votes. And so in 2018, and so if you're on this call and like you have that conversation with your city council person and they suck, run against them. Because local level is really easy to seize power. Like it's hard to become a congressperson or a president, but like you can become a city council person, like surprising ease. So yeah, definitely second to what Valen said about paying attention to municipal elections and getting involved in them if you're unhappy with your representation.
Definitely. And Tiffany, do you have some ways to get involved? And then we're going to kick it to the questions. I'm seeing there's a few already coming into the chat, and I want to make sure we leave time to answer as many questions as we can.
Sure. So echoing, join an organization. All of the people that we admire, historical figures that we say are civil rights legends or human rights giants, all of those people were accountable to organizations. I really challenge you to find someone whom you admire, who you believe helped to shift the landscape in any particular country, especially not in this one, without being accountable to an organization. So you find where you have alignment and support, right? And that means supporting with your time, supporting with your dollars, and your talent, right? Just like church, time, talent, treasure, right? Yeah. Find the different things that you're good at. If you're good at comms, if you're really amazing at knocking doors, all of those things that we think about in this like narrow, the narrow category of like electoral organizing are useful and essential, honestly, when it comes to any other kind of organizing. And remember that we must engage in a multiplicity of tactics. And so defunding or divest, it is about building something else up and tearing down the harmful thing, right? It is not about, so when you're pressed about defund, remember that you're talking about building up systems that heal. What we saw in Atlanta and is this during the uprisings, one of our council people authored Rayshard Brooks' bill, and it would have held in escrow essentially a certain amount of money until changes, these changes were made within the Atlanta Police Department. The Atlanta City Council listened to 14 hours of public comment, 14 hours of public comment, overwhelmingly in support of Rayshard Brooks' bill during the budget hearing. But they did not have the courage to pass that legislation or any legislation like it. And so when we are talking about one tactic, which is using your vote, the other tactics have to include the accountability mechanisms to make the material changes you want to see in your communities possible, right? You elect these people, and then what do you do to hold them accountable? When we're saying Mayor Bottoms said in 2019 she was going to close the jail, what are the things we are doing in community every single day to make it seem possible? And without organizing, we would not have any responses to the harm that is being done by people who oppose prison abolition, people who oppose the investment in communities. And so when people say, well, I don't believe in reforms, that doesn't mean that they're saying they don't believe in any policy changes that reduce harm in communities. What they are saying is they don't believe in policy changes for the sake of policy changes. If we know that body cameras in certain communities, so why invest in body cameras in this way when we see the body camera cities that adopt body cameras in some cases exact more violence on communities? A duty to intervene, yes, that's important, but what does it say about the cities that continue to have killings while they have duty to intervene and bans on chokeholds? So we got to be real about where the harm comes from, and you learn the most in community with other people, which means you cannot be a lone wolf. You do not get to be a superstar, right? You have to be accountable to other people in organizations. And so I think that, that's, for me, the key to everything. That's how Georgia, I think Insay is on this call, what we saw shift in Georgia had everything to do with organizing. It had so little to do with who was in the White House and so much to do with the power that has been built over time by buckling down and staying the course. And so when it comes to abolition, prison abolition or defund or divest, invest, weathering that storm is important. You have to be willing to stay the course, even when it's unpopular, because for a very long time, people said, what was the response to Black Lives Matter? It was all lives matter. What was the response to Black Power? It was to call them terrorists, right? And so there's never going to be a slogan that makes the establishment comfortable. And so instead of chasing their comfort, we have to stay in community with one another to prove up that what we are recommending actually works.
Okay, and so there was a question of like, what is like a quick sort of like elevator pitch or retort? I mean, there's a lot of folks that are just going to be intentionally obtuse about the meaning of defund, right? And so we realize that. And so those folks, we know we're not going to, but there's a lot of folks that are just like, they really don't understand and want to understand. So like, what's a quick, like, I mean, I loved when you said, you know, we're building up so that we can heal, you know, like I love that, but like what is something that that can get the message across like clear and concisely and be like, this is what this really means to combat this like misinformation.
Yeah, and so I would take that back to the sort of motivational interviewing techniques that I was describing with talking about to our neighbors earlier. So Fallon, really quick, we'll like go through it. So like so talk about a kind of crisis that you're worried about happening in your community.
Well, see, what happens is, you know, I live on an acre by myself, and sometimes people randomly come and sit in my driveway, and it makes me scared, and I don't know what to do. And I don't necessarily want to call the police on them, but what else can I do to make sure I don't want to go out there?
Yeah, so in this instance, defund the police means fund a different kind of service that could come and make sure you feel safe if there's someone parking in your driveway, but you don't necessarily want them to get shot if they're just lost and park so they can get their GPS up to date. And so engaging with people around things that they're scared of having happen to them or to their families or their communities, and talking about how we can fund alternatives that actually prevent those things from happening in the first place or make us feel safer because they are met with a non-police response. So rather than trying to like pitch a big spiel about like what defund is or what a short spiel is, like engaging with them about what they're really concerned about and kind of personalizing it to the issues that are on their heart is how I would sort of go about that brief conversation around what means.
Okay, I do see that there was a question and to that like sort of scenario, it said what service, I'm not hearing specifics, to replaces police response. Perhaps, you know, I should have went with, you know, there's someone drunk sleeping in a car and, you know, but what does that, when we reimagine policing, like what do those services look like beyond perhaps, you know, like your 311s and your mental health professionals? Like, is that we're just in community with our neighbors and my neighbor's door goes outside and tells the people to leave? Like, what does that look like?
Yeah, so I think that, oh, sorry, Tiffany, actually you want to go ahead, I've talked a lot.
I was going to say that, so the idea that there should be one service is probably the first thing that we should dispel, right? That there are many different things that happen in community. And the problem is that we're using police as a one size fits all response to anything we don't like. We don't like seeing poor people sleeping on the street, police come to that. We don't like seeing people in mental health crisis, well, police come to that. We don't like it when kids do not show up to school, even virtually, right? Police come to that. And so the problem is that one of the problems that we're looking for one response to something that is to human behavior, which is expansive and diverse. I think if you were to look at there are charts that you can find that show you what 911 calls look like. And like 1 to 3% of those calls actually have anything to do with violence. 1 to 3%, right? Most of them are things like someone sleeping on a bench. I got a call on Saturday night and my friend said, Tiffany, I'm so sorry to call you so late. There is a woman who's found her way to my porch and she's obviously in crisis and I don't want to call the police. What can I do? And I said, well, now we have 311. You can call. You can tell them you need a non-emergency responder to come and assist the woman. About 45 minutes later, my friend wrote me back and said, "Thank you so much." Paramedics came and helped her.
Oh, I think you froze, Tiffany. But I'll just plug that, yes, expansion of 311, it's only in the city of Atlanta right now, and it's only in certain districts. So expanding it at least to the entire city, but looking at expanding that statewide would be amazing. And I know those are some things that you're working on in Athens, Mariah.
Yeah, and then you mentioned, Fallon, strengthening our communities, because we offload so much of our responsibility to our neighbors on the state. Like, for example, speaking with one of my fellow commissioners just yesterday about his son walked into an ice cream shop by himself, and someone saw a little boy alone and called 911. And the police then called his parents and said, "Hey, this is Officer X. Do you have a son?" So imagine how terrifying that is to get that phone call from the police department. So that woman who saw that little boy in the ice cream shop by himself could have very easily walked up to him and said, "Hey, where are your parents?" And so thinking about, I'm going to post a link to a book called Beyond Survival. It's about transformative justice strategies, thinking about how we can work with our neighbors to keep each other safe in, small instances, like somebody's blood sugar is low and they're, acting weird in the street. If you have a strong relationship with them, you can go intervene instead of calling 911. And so in addition to policies and state responses, there's also community responses and cultural shifts that need to be made in order for us to get back to our roots of looking after one another in a way that the state can and shouldn't.
Got you. And speaking of resources, I think another good book to read is for We Do This Until We're Free. Definitely about abolition. And I think it will help us to dig deeper and to think through. It's a series of essays and etc. So I guess, are there any final questions? Does anyone want to drop any other questions in the chat for Mariah as we're wrapping up? Curious your thoughts on how next doors in terms of being yes, we will definitely can have some discussions via the group packs. I'm definitely want to, everyone's time, but we can have some discussions going on about this in the Georgia Alliance for Social Justice discussion group, and we can have further conversations, but I like to try to hold people to their time. So let me pin Tiffany back.
With the question of next door, that's an organizing space. That's a space where you can start to inject new ideas about the community's responsibility to each other. It's a place where you can meet your neighbors and get to know what their needs are, so that if they need something, you can show up for them if they're having a crisis, and vice versa, as well as challenging ideas of, oh, I saw a stranger walking down the street, code for someone brown or who looks homeless. Should I call 911? Like, starting to engage with those ideas and transform people's understanding of public safety through engagement with those ideas on platforms like Nextdoor.
Yeah, and I see Marissa saying it seems to function like police assisting with sharing videos and Ring. There are settings in there. I know I have a Ring, but I deliberately make sure to go in and not to make it where the police can just, share my videos. I'm not going to be an op, but I do want to have cameras and see what's going on in my yard, right? So I think there's ways that we can do that. But those are definitely some privacy and security concerns around that. And I think it's worth talking to, again, your council folks, your legislators and stuff about what type of privacy and things you would want to have around those issues. Insay said she would love to see a Georgia Alliance for Social Justice report card. We hope that is coming soon. Actually, Insay, because we're hopefully within the next month or two are going to have a C4. So I'm super excited about doing a report card and possibly some forums and stuff with more elected officials and folks. And I think that's it I see of questions or concerns. So like I said, thank y'all for joining us today. Thank you again to Mariah. Thank you to Tiffany. Y'all are always so gracious and joining me when I asked for, the call to help us out. I think this was an amazing discussion. We will be putting it on our YouTube and then sharing it to the discussion group, and perhaps having some type of watch party or deeper discussion groups about this. Mariah has dropped her socials. If you have more questions, it's Mariah for Athens on Twitter and IG. I know Tiffany, as she defends it on Twitter. I think your she defends it on IG too, right? No, okay. My Twitter is I'll share Mariah's email with you, Pax. My Twitter is Fallon McClure GA. If you want to follow, you'll keep updated. Like I said, this is a series. We'll have more discussions coming up. Our next one is on immigration under Biden, and just because we have a president who is essentially much better than last doesn't mean we shouldn't still be holding them accountable, right? There's still a lot of things happening with our folks, and we need to make sure that we have accountability at all levels. So again, thank you for joining us, and yeah, have a great afternoon.